Remember when you're playing the Game Boy when your parents are driving on the highway and it's dark out? So you're holding the Game Boy up, trying to get some street light in just so you can see what's going on.
Oh, hi, Mark.
What's up, Freccero fam? Welcome back to my channel where I like to explore everything life has to offer. And for this video, I have to talk about this because I just finished watching the Tetris movie on Apple TV, which, by the way, an amazing movie. I was actually at the Tetris movie installation at South by Southwest when they were promoting it. I also, and this is true, I met the official creator of Tetris. Here's a picture of me and him. Super nice guy, by the way. And I gotta say as well, what a phenomenal suit jacket. Unfortunately, though, I did not get to see the Tetris movie when at South by Southwest. I did see like a mini Tetris trailer later on, but it wasn't until a couple days ago when I was like, all right, it's finally released. Let's finally watch the Tetris movie. And I gotta say, I love the movie. It is the whole story behind Tetris, and especially how it got put on Nintendo, especially, the Nintendo Game Boy and everything. It is a truly stranger than fiction story with the Soviet Union getting involved and the KGB and people literally risking their lives just to have the rights and authorization to release Tetris. And I gotta say, the directing, the acting, the scripting, it was just a ridiculous movie from start to finish. I honestly felt like I was watching more of a James Bond movie than I was an actual just Tetris documentary. Because going into it, you're like, oh yeah, Tetris, arguably one of, if not the most famous video game of all time. We've all played it. It's pretty much on every platform from the original Nintendo and arcades all the way up now to pretty much on every iPhone or Android, every smartphone. It's pretty much existed on every platform. And at first, when watching the movie, I was like, oh yeah, maybe it's going to talk about maybe the science of Tetris, the programming behind it. But the story is just wild. And I gotta say, the entire Tetris movie was just amazing. I absolutely loved it. One huge part of it is they talk about the legendary Nintendo Game Boy. And it really reminded me just how epic and, I'm gonna be honest, I think game-changing the Game Boy was for numerous different reasons. I know this is a bold statement, but I feel like it's the most influential piece of video game hardware ever created. And I know people could probably argue that maybe with the original Nintendo, right, being an actual console in your home, but I still feel like the Game Boy, for a couple different reasons I'm going to mention, really was revolutionary. Because I still remember, right, I still remember my first ever console or video game thing, so to speak, was actually the original Nintendo. Started playing it and I'm like, oh my God, this is amazing. And I had the classics, right? The original Super Mario Brothers. I had Super Mario Brothers 3, which also was an amazing game. I never really played 2 that much, being honest. I feel like 2 is kind of an odd outlier, so to speak. I feel like it was like really 1 and then 3 in my mind. I had Tetris, of course. I had Duck Hunt, especially with the gun, which, by the way, can we just say that gun was so ahead of its time to actually have to point at the screen? I mean, that's the kind of stuff that decades later was on the Wii. So I feel like that was such like a cool thing, way ahead of its time. I had DuckTales as well, in addition to tons of other games. The second console I then owned was actually the Nintendo Game Boy Pocket. I feel like a lot of people forget about it. And then after that, Nintendo 64, and then so on and so forth. But jumping back to the Game Boy, and I do want to say, I want to give a shout out to the Game Boy Pocket, because when a lot of people think of the Game Boy, they think of the original Game Boy, then a huge jump, then Game Boy Color, right? Having color games with a super small device. Then you have, of course, Game Boy Advance, then Game Boy Advance SP, which finally had that light, the best feature ever. Because I remember, being on the highway when it's dark out, when my parents are driving, and having to hold up the Game Boy just to get some light in so I could see what was going on. Because in case people don't remember this, the original Game Boys, there wasn't a light on it. So if it was dark out or you were in a dark room, you just couldn't see anything. So I remember having one of these odd hookups, this like flimsy little thing where you plugged it in and then have this light shining down on the Game Boy with this odd glare. And it kind of worked. It did drain your batteries super fast, but it did kind of work. So when the Game Boy SP came out, I believe the first Game Boy with an actual light, you're like, no way. I can play this in the dark without any weird hookups. And in addition, the Game Boy SP you could charge via a wall. And then, of course, the Nintendo DS. And then yada, yada, yada. But the Nintendo Game Boy Pocket has a special place in my heart because, I mean, I know it sounds kind of weird, but as it sounds, it's a smaller version of the original Game Boy. And the portability, let's be honest, of the Nintendo Game Boy, by far the best feature of it. And that's why I feel like the Game Boy Pocket was so underrated, because it was the first time you're like, wow, I literally have a gaming device in my pocket. And at the time, that was so revolutionary, you know, I think for a bunch of different reasons. I think the biggest thing, especially for younger kids like myself when I had it, is there was a sense of almost like autonomy or responsibility that you're like, I can play this whenever I want. And I really feel like this paved the way for video games in general, because like I said, especially when I was younger, you know, I remember this in the 90s, you'd play, like, say, the Nintendo. I never owned the Super Nintendo, but obviously this falls under that. Or like, say, Nintendo 64. What did you have to do? You had to like hook it up, put it on channel 3, and then eventually RCA came out. But even still, you had to take over your family's TV. A lot easier said than done, right? A lot easier said than done. And let's be honest as well, it was way easier to get caught when playing a console rather than compared to, like, say, a Game Boy Pocket being hid under covers like this and playing it and everything. It was way easier to play overall. And like I said, I think this created a unique sense of autonomy and responsibility where you're like, I can do this on my own. I can put in the batteries on my own. I have all my own games. I don't share this with anybody else. Anybody who's had brothers or sisters, remember, maybe fighting over to play Nintendo 64 or having to have different accounts, or one of you wants to play Super Smash, but the other one wants to play GoldenEye. With the Game Boy, you don't have to worry about any of that. The control was both literally and figuratively in your hands. I mean, I even remember sometimes coming back to my house after school and being like, all right, I could play N64, and I do have to unlock and get a few more stars in Super Mario 64, or I could just play Game Boy in my room, not have to disturb anybody. I could do what I want and catch more Pokemon in Pokemon Red. As, you know, a child or as a kid, you could do it without having to have a parent around you. You could play it however you wanted to. You could do whatever you wanted. And I feel like that whole sense of freedom overall is really what propelled a lot of people to continuing playing video games, especially young to old. And there was a scene in the Tetris movie, which I feel like was such a genius statement. And that is, if you want to sell the Nintendo Game Boy, but you're going to pair it with Super Mario Land, you could sell hundreds of thousands of copies to kids. But if you want to sell millions of copies of the Nintendo Game Boy to not just kids, but adults too, you pair it with Tetris. And I think, being honest, you can make a legitimate argument that the game Tetris not only propelled a lot of people into gaming. I mean, everybody has played Tetris, but it also propelled the Nintendo Game Boy. Ironically, the first game I ever actually owned with the Nintendo Game Boy Pocket was Super Mario Land. And I remember playing it when I was younger, and I'm like, oh, this is a fun game, or whatever. The second game I owned, which truly to me changed everything, Pokemon Red. I know this is a big debate, red or blue. I was always red, always picked Charmander as well. Ironically, my brother was always Pokemon Blue and always picked Squirtle. So it was like kind of the funny, perfect yin and yang, so to speak. And even still, I did own Tetris, and I love Tetris. Always have, always will. The type of game that you could be 3 years old or 30 or 90 and still love it because it's super simple. Let's be honest. I mean, it's a very simple game. You know, you complete the lines, it goes away, you just do that and hopefully don't get to the top. Yet, at the same time, as we all know, there's a ton of strategy and a ton of critical thinking. And being honest, the pairing of Tetris and the Nintendo Game Boy, I feel like was the perfect pairing when it comes to gaming to really get a whole different market into gaming, not just with the Nintendo Game Boy, but I think just in general, getting a lot of people into gaming. I mean, another thing, if you think about it, when it comes to the Nintendo Game Boy, you put in batteries, you put in the cartridge, that's it. I mean, we all remember dealing with the original Nintendo, having to plug it in and figure it out. There was, you know, some mechanics to it, putting it on channel 3, like I mentioned earlier, blah, 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 blah. The steps to eventually playing it were a lot bigger and a lot greater. And I know a lot of adults, I remember being like, this is too complicated. And in addition, let's be honest, like 10% of the time, the original Nintendo actually worked. And did you know there's actually a note, and I'm not making this up, that says you're not supposed to blow into the cartridges to make it work? And I'm like, that's That's the only way it worked. But with the Game Boy, one, it pretty much worked all the time. But two, the barrier to entry, the steps you had to take were so little. You can look at different pairings, right, throughout the years of gaming. You know, a lot of people argue that Super Mario Brothers helped save gaming, which I feel like there's a good point to that because it really kind of put video gaming and buying video games for your household on the map. You could argue Super Mario 64 with the Nintendo 64, Crash Bandicoot with PlayStation, Halo for Xbox. The list goes on and on and on. But I feel like the combination of Tetris and Game Boy was just the perfect pairing. However, and this may be a very debatable perspective, especially given this video where I've only talked about really Tetris and Game Boy. If someone had to ask me, what game do you think really propelled the Game Boy? Of course, I think Tetris would be number 2, but I still feel like Pokemon for sure. I still remember seeing this classic weird Pokemon commercial on TV.
Hey, little buddy, want a ride?
Pikachu!
Yeah, whatever. I'll be right back.
Where can you catch all 150 Pokemon? On your Game Boy, that's where. Pokemon for Game Boy is here. With both packs, you can catch them all. Games and systems sold separately.
By the way, watching this now as an adult, such a weird commercial with a random bus driver. It's kind of a weird commercial, but I still remember seeing that commercial in addition to the classic Game Boy commercials.
They said it wasn't humanly possible. All the power and excitement of Nintendo right in the palm of your hand. Introducing Game Boy. It's portable, it's in stereo, and its games are interchangeable. Game Boy comes complete with batteries and the outrageous new game Tetris. And for head-to-head competition, use Video Link and blow your opponent away. Game Boy, only from Nintendo. Now you're playing with power, portable power.
And I do feel like that if I had to pick a game that really propelled the Game Boy, although Tetris I think has a definite good second place, I think nothing compares to Pokemon Red and Blue. I mean, people were going out and buying Game Boys just to play it. It really featured, I'm gonna be honest, like every amazing part, I think, of the nature and capabilities of the Game Boy, right? The fact that you could play it anywhere you were going, you could save the game. You could explore more. There were all these new worlds to explore. There was 151 Pokemon. Gets debatable if you include Missing No, which, by the way, in case you're curious, Missing No is actually my favorite Pokemon, and there's a bunch more glitch Pokemon as well. With that being said, you know, the classic 151 in Pokemon Red and Blue, so many different moves and different types. There's so much to learn. The second thing, battling and trading. The fact that you could get the Nintendo Game Boy Link to link from one Game Boy to another, I mean, if you think about it, that's kind of the first ever cross-console battling, right? Yes, that existed in arcade games and everything, but to combine and connect two separate consoles was revolutionary, where you could have your own Pokemon on your game, your opponent or your friend have their Pokemon on their game, you connect the link, you battle, whatever happens, happens, and then you disconnect the link, and yet you can go your separate ways. And then lastly, which is just a super forgotten about aspect of the Game Boy, was the Game Boy printer. We could actually print out stuff related to what's going on in your Pokemon game, which is so insane. I mean, think about it. Think about being, 12 or 13 years old. Your parents are telling you what to do. You have to go to school. You have to do this. You have pretty much no freedom in a sense, right? Within reason. You have no freedom, yet you have the ability now to play a game whenever you want, however you want, on your own terms. And not only that, but now you have your own mini printer where you can print out your own stuff however you want, and if you want to paste it on the fridge or stick it somewhere, whatever, right? That was such a cool feature. I mean, I even remember, which is, again, I feel like there's so many underrated parts of the Nintendo Game Boy. I even remember having the Game Boy Camera, which was an actual camera, a legitimate camera, where you could put it into your Game Boy, take pictures, edit the pictures as well, and then if you wanted to, print it out using the Game Boy printer. I mean, if you think about that now, if let's say Apple released that for the iPhone, where you connect this small little thing to your iPhone and you can print out pictures right then and there, we'd be like, wow, that's such a great feature. That's such a cool, little thing I can buy where I have this little small thing and I can connect it to the iPhone or whatever and use it and blah, blah, blah. And yet Nintendo was doing this in what, like 1999, early 2000? That's why it's just so wild to think, you know, when you look back on it, how influential and just game-changing, literally and figuratively, the Nintendo Game Boy was. Like I said, especially for younger kids to just have that autonomy, that own self-responsibility, that freedom to play video games however you wanted, when you wanted, be able to take pictures with it, be able to battle with it across different consoles, be able to print out things, whether it's a picture or something related to your Pokemon game or other games or whatever, and the ability overall to play video games on your own terms, how you wanted. And the fact that you can also pair that with just how influential Tetris was. I mean, the second Alexei released it, and it started going, I guess I call it viral, right? Because back in the day, there wasn't really the internet the way we know it now. But the fact that a video game way back then got so popular, employers were getting mad because people were playing it too much on the job. I mean, it just shows how much Tetris really propelled the entire video game market to realize, wow, there's definitely way more here than we thought. And then around the same time, with Nintendo being like, okay, we're releasing this amazing thing called the Nintendo Game Boy, and the fact that it all came together in the way that it did, not only with Tetris, but especially with the Game Boy, I gotta say, by far the most influential piece of video game hardware ever.